The frost came early to the Wyoming foothills that October of 1881, thick enough on the ground by dawn that Josephine Caro's breath hung in front of her face like something solid, and by the time she and her twin sister Adeline had walked the quarter-mile from their dugout to the rock face they had claimed as storage, both women had stopped feeling their fingers entirely. They were 23 years old, orphaned by a diphtheria outbreak 6 years before that had taken both parents inside the same terrible week. And they had spent every season since learning the hard way that survival on a homestead this far from town was not a thing that forgave softness. Their claim sat 11 miles outside Larkspur, a settlement barely large enough to warrant its own name on a territorial map, and their nearest neighbor was a 2-hour ride in weather that cooperated, which it rarely did. The cave had been Adeline's discovery the previous spring, a shallow opening in the limestone bluff behind their claim that ran perhaps 15 feet back into the rock before narrowing to nothing. Cool in summer and just above freezing in winter, ideal for keeping their small store of root vegetables and salted meat from spoiling before the thaw. What it lacked was space, and what the sisters had decided, over a long winter of counting potatoes and calculating exactly how thin their supplies had grown, was that the shallow chamber needed shelves cut directly into the stone itself, deeper recesses that would let them store more without losing floor space to crates and barrels that took up room they did not have. Josephine held the lamp while Adeline worked the chisel, and then they traded, because neither woman had the strength in her forearms to work stone for more than 20 minutes at a stretch without her hands beginning to shake. The limestone was soft enough to yield, harder than either of them had expected when they began. Chip, chip, chip. The sound filled the small chamber and echoed back at them in a way that made the cave feel larger than it was. And after 3 days of steady work, they had cut a shelf deep enough to hold a full crate of potatoes. And after a week, they had cut 2 more. It was on the 9th day, with November's first real snow already dusting the ground outside, that Adeline's chisel struck something that was not stone. She stopped. Josephine, watching by lamplight, saw her sister's shoulders go rigid. "What is it?" Josephine asked. "I don't know," Adeline said. "It doesn't sound right." She struck the spot again, and the sound that came back was different from every strike before it. Not the flat, absorbed thud of solid limestone, but something with air behind it, something hollow. Thump! It was unmistakable. Neither sister spoke for a long moment. Their dog, a rangy brown hound named Scout, who had followed them into the cave and curled near the entrance out of the wind, lifted his head from his paws and let out a low sound in his throat, not quite a growl, something closer to unease, an animal registering a change in the room before the humans in it fully understood what had changed. "That's not right," Josephine said finally, echoing her sister's words back to her because she did not have better ones of her own. They worked through the rest of that day with a kind of focused quiet neither of them commented on, widening the strange hollow spot rather than deepening the shelf they had originally intended. And by the time the light outside had gone fully to dusk, they had opened a gap in the stone wide enough to fit an arm through. Josephine crouched beside her, holding the lamp as close to the gap as she dared without risking the flame catching on anything unseen. And for a moment, neither sister moved, both of them simply staring at the dark opening as though it might answer some question neither had yet found words to ask. Adeline reached in first, her whole body tense, and her fingers found nothing but cold air on the other side. "There's a space back here," she said, her voice gone strange with the discovery. "Josephine, there's a whole space back here." They did not sleep well that night. Both sisters lay awake in the dugout, listening to the wind pull at the canvas covering their small window, each of them turning over the same unanswerable question without saying it aloud, because saying it aloud made it feel too large to hold. Someone had made that hollow space. Someone had built something back there, inside solid rock, and then sealed it away behind a wall thin enough that two women with a chisel had broken through it in the space of 9 days. By morning, the snow outside had stopped, leaving perhaps 2 inches on the ground, cold enough that the sisters wrapped themselves in every layer they owned before walking back out to the bluff. Scout trotted ahead of them the whole way, ears pinned forward, alert in a manner that made Josephine's stomach tighten with something between excitement and dread. You have to understand what this discovery meant to 2 women alone on a claim that barely fed them through winter. It was not treasure they were imagining, not exactly, though the thought crossed both their minds more than once. It was the possibility of space, of shelter, of something built by hands other than their own that might make the next winter and the one after it survivable in a way the dugout alone had never quite managed to be. They spent the better part of that second day widening the gap enough for a person to fit through, working in shifts, one holding the lamp steady while the other chipped carefully at the stone, mindful now of preserving whatever lay beyond, rather than simply breaking through it. The limestone here was different from the rock they had been cutting shelves into, Josephine noticed, smoother in places, almost as though it had been worked deliberately rather than simply eroded by time and water. By late afternoon, the gap was wide enough. Adeline went first because she had found the hollow spot to begin with, and neither sister felt it was right to argue her out of that claim, and Josephine passed the lamp through ahead of her before following. The chamber on the other side of the wall was larger than either of them had imagined possible, easily 20 feet across, with a ceiling high enough that Josephine, tallest of the two by perhaps an inch, could stand without stooping. The lamp threw shifting light across walls that had been smoothed and shaped with obvious care, and as the light moved, more of the space revealed itself in pieces, the way a room reveals itself to eyes still adjusting from full dark. Adeline moved slowly along the near wall, one hand trailing over the stone as though she needed the touch of it to fully believe what her eyes were showing her. And Josephine followed a few steps behind with the lamp, both women speaking in hushed voices without quite deciding to, the particular quiet people fall into inside a space that feels, for reasons neither could name, like it deserves reverence rather than noise. There was a hearth cut into the far wall, blackened with old smoke, a chimney shaft rising up through the rock above it toward some outlet the sisters could not see from where they stood. There were recesses cut at even intervals along the walls, clearly meant for storage, some still holding objects the sisters could not identify from a distance. There was, near the center of the room, a flat stone surface raised knee-high, worked smooth on top, that could only have served as a table. It did not smell like a natural cavern. Josephine noticed that before she noticed anything else, once the initial shock of scale had passed. It smelled made. Dust hung in the air in a way that never quite settled, disturbed by their entrance and slow to return to stillness, as though the room had been waiting, patient and undisturbed, for exactly this kind of interruption. "Someone lived here," Adeline said, her voice barely above a whisper, though there was no one left to overhear them. "Someone built all of this." Josephine moved the lamp slowly across the room, revealing the raised stone table more fully, and it was there, resting at its center, that she found the leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age, its pages swollen slightly from years of trapped moisture, sitting exactly where someone had apparently left it, undisturbed, for longer than either sister could begin to guess. Adeline carried the book back to the dugout, wrapped in her own shawl, cradling it the way a person carries something they suspect might crumble at rough handling. And that night, by the light of their single lamp, the two sisters sat together at their small table and opened it for the first time. The handwriting inside was small and careful, cramped in places where the writer had clearly been rationing paper, and the first legible entry, dated some 22 years earlier, read simply, "Struck the hollow today. 3 months of digging, and I near gave up twice. There is a whole room back here waiting on me, like it knew I'd come." The sisters read late into the night, passing the lamp between them, piecing together the story of a man who had never signed his full name, referring to himself only as R throughout the journal. A solitary figure who had come west after some unspecified loss, the entries hinting at a wife and a home left behind in circumstances he never explained in full. Outside, the wind kept up its steady push against the dugout walls, and the lamp burned lower with every passing hour. But neither sister suggested stopping to sleep. There was something about the small, careful handwriting that made the idea of setting the book aside, even for rest, feel like a small betrayal of the man who had left it behind. He had found the cave, much as the sisters had, and had spent the better part of 2 years hollowing the chamber deeper, hauling out stone by hand, cutting the hearth, shaping the shelves, building himself a shelter that could not be burned out by raiders or torn apart by weather the way a surface cabin could. "I do not know if anyone will ever find this place," one entry read, "but if they do, I hope they find it as I did, empty and waiting and ready to be made into something." The final entries grew shorter, the handwriting less careful, mentions of a cough that would not clear and a winter that had come harder than the ones before it. The last entry in the book, dated abruptly with no explanation of what followed, read only, "Snow again. Can't seem to keep the fire going through the night anymore. If I don't wake tomorrow, I hope whoever finds this knows I was not afraid. I built something that will outlast me. That is enough." There was nothing after that. No final farewell, no explanation, just blank pages stretching to the end of the book, and both sisters sat in silence for a long while after Josephine finished reading the last entry aloud, the lamp guttering low, Scout asleep by the door with one ear still twitching toward the sound of the wind outside. "He died alone," Adeline said finally. "We don't know that," Josephine said, though her voice carried little conviction. "We don't know what happened to him." But neither of them could shake the particular grief of it. The image of a man building an entire shelter with his own hands, season after patient season, only to vanish from his own record without so much as a name attached to the final page. They searched the chamber again the following morning by full daylight, carried in through the gap they had cut, looking for any sign of what had become of him, a grave, a marker, anything, and found nothing. No bones, no scattered belongings beyond the tools he had clearly left behind. A rusted pick and a shovel with a rotted handle propped in one corner. Whatever had happened to the man who called himself only R, he had either walked out of that chamber under his own power and never returned, or something had taken him that left no trace behind for two sisters to find 22 years later. It unsettled Adeline more than she wanted to admit. Josephine noticed it in the way her sister kept glancing toward the hearth, the shelves, the smooth stone table, as though expecting some further answer to surface if she simply looked hard enough. But there was also, underneath the unease, something neither sister could fully deny. A sense of being entrusted with something. A room built to outlast its builder, waiting patiently for 22 years, and now, at last, occupied again. Word of the discovery could not stay contained for long in a settlement as small as Larkspur, and within 2 weeks a man named Dorian Voss, who ran the only mercantile within 20 miles, and fancied himself the closest thing the territory had to an authority on such matters, rode out to the sisters' claim to see the chamber for himself. He arrived on a gray gelding that had clearly been well fed through the winter, a detail Josephine noted without comment, since a man's horse often told more truth about his circumstances than his conversation did. And he tied the animal to the fence post nearest the dugout before making his way toward the bluff with the confident stride of someone who had already decided how the visit would unfold before it began. Voss was not an unkind man by nature, but he carried the particular confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to, and he stood in the newly opened chamber, turning his hat in his hands and delivering pronouncements as though the sisters had invited his judgment rather than simply his presence. "This ought to be reported to the land office," he said. "A structure like this changes the value of a claim considerably. You'll want it noted properly, filed, so there's no dispute later about who has rights to it." "We have rights to it," Adeline said. "It sits on our land. We found it." "Finding it and having it recognized are two different matters," Voss said, not unkindly, but with the particular certainty of a man who had never once had to fight for recognition of anything that was already his. "I only mean to help. A claim like this, unregistered properly, could draw the wrong kind of attention. Better it's on record, plain and clear, that this belongs to the Caro sisters and no one else." Josephine studied him for a long moment, weighing the offer against a lifetime of watching men in this territory offer help that came, eventually, with strings attached. "What would it cost us," she asked, "to have you help us file it?" "Nothing but the trouble of my time," Voss said. "I'd only ask that you let me be the one to tell the story of the finding when folks ask, since I expect they will. Good for the store's reputation, being the man who helped two sisters secure their claim proper. Adeline and Josephine exchanged a glance that carried an entire conversation between them, the kind of silent understanding twins built over 23 years of sharing a life, and settled, without needing to say it aloud, on cautious agreement. It was Adeline who pointed out, quietly, once Voss had ridden off ahead of them toward town, that men like him rarely offered help without expecting the story to reflect well on themselves in the retelling. And Josephine agreed, though neither sister found much reason to resent it. A little vanity on Voss's part cost them nothing so long as the paperwork itself held up. And in a territory where two unmarried women could find their claims challenged or their rights questioned on the flimsiest of pretexts, having the matter filed clean and beyond dispute felt, to both of them, worth far more than the minor irritation of Voss embellishing his own role. They rode into Larkspur with Voss 3 days later and filed the necessary paperwork at the land office, formalizing what had already been theirs by discovery and, if Voss told the story with himself cast rather more centrally than the facts strictly supported, the sisters found they did not much mind, since the paperwork itself was sound, and their claim, and the chamber within it, was now legally beyond dispute. The larger difficulty came not from Voss, but from the winter itself, which settled over the foothills that year with a severity the sisters had not seen since their parents died. Temperatures dropping low enough that the dugout, drafty and thin-walled, became genuinely dangerous to sleep in without a fire burning through the entire night. It was Adeline who first suggested, tentatively, that they move their sleeping quarters into the chamber itself. "It's warmer back there," she said. "You felt it. The stone holds heat different than the dugout ever has, and that hearth still draws smoke proper. We tested it ourselves." "It feels strange," Josephine admitted, "sleeping in a dead man's house." "It's not his house anymore," Adeline said gently. "He built it to outlast him. Those were his own words. I think he'd rather it kept two people warm through a hard winter than sit empty another 22 years waiting on nobody." They moved their few belongings into the chamber within the week. It took the better part of a day ferrying blankets, cookware, and the small store of personal belongings each sister owned across the short stretch of ground between the dugout and the bluff. And by the time the last crate had been set into place along one of the deeper shelves, both women stood in the chamber's entrance, looking back at the space with something like disbelief, as though they had not quite expected the arrangement to feel as immediately right as it did. They set their bedding near the hearth, used the smooth stone table for meals, stored their supplies in the very shelves the mysterious builder had cut decades before, and for the first time since their parents' deaths, both sisters found that winter had stopped feeling like something to merely survive. The weeks between moving into the chamber and the trouble arriving in January passed with a rhythm the sisters had not known since childhood, a settled, unhurried pattern of days that had nothing to do with mere survival and everything to do with something closer to contentment. Josephine took to mapping the chamber's dimensions on a scrap of paper some evenings, marking where the light fell at different hours, where the smoke drew cleanest, where the stone stayed driest through the heaviest snow. A habit Adeline teased her over gently, but that both sisters understood, without needing to discuss it, as a way of making the space fully theirs, in the telling as much as in the living. They found, too, small evidences of the builder's care that had not been obvious at first glance. A narrow channel cut along the floor near the entrance, angled just enough to carry meltwater away from the sleeping area. A second, smaller hearth niche near the back wall, clearly meant for a lamp rather than a fire, positioned so its light would reach the farthest shelf without smoke gathering where a person might sleep. Every discovery deepened the sisters' sense that the man who called himself only R had built with a patience and a foresight that spoke of someone who had expected, or at least hoped, to live in that chamber for a very long time. The cold snap that had driven the sisters to reconsider their sleeping arrangements did not ease quickly. Ice formed thick along the inside edges of the dugout's single window, and more than one morning that January, the water bucket by the door had frozen solid overnight. A small, daily reminder of exactly how unforgiving the season had become, and exactly how much the chamber's steady warmth had come to matter to both women's survival. The trouble came in January, deep enough into winter that the sisters had grown comfortable in their new quarters. Comfortable enough that the sudden knock at the outer dugout, now used only for storing tools, startled them badly when it came at an hour no honest traveler would choose to be riding. Josephine went to investigate with the lamp, Scout at her heels with his hackles raised, and found no one there, only fresh boot prints in the snow leading toward the bluff and the cave entrance. Prints that did not belong to Adeline, who was still inside the chamber banking the fire for the night. "Someone's out here," Josephine called back, her voice tight. Adeline emerged with the fire poker still in her hand, and together the sisters followed the boot prints a short distance before losing them in a stretch of wind-scoured rock. And though they searched for the better part of an hour, they found no further trace of whoever had come near their claim in the dark, and then vanished as quietly as they had arrived. That first missing visit left both sisters shaken in a way neither fully admitted to the other, and for 2 nights afterward they took turns staying awake near the hearth while the other slept, Scout stationed between them with his ears perked toward the entrance. A routine neither of them wanted to keep permanently, but neither felt safe abandoning either. It happened again 4 nights later, this time with clearer evidence. One of the storage crates in the old dugout disturbed, several strips of salted meat missing, and a set of prints leading away toward the eastern ridge that neither sister recognized from any of their infrequent neighbors. "We need to report this," Adeline said. "Someone's stealing from us. Could be a drifter, could be worse. Could be someone who knows what we found back there," Josephine said, the thought settling cold in her stomach as she said it aloud. Could be someone wanting more than meat. They rode into Larkspur the following morning and reported the theft to the territorial marshal stationed there, a weathered man named Emmett Falk, who listened carefully and promised to ride out and look over the ground himself, though he cautioned them plainly that a lone drifter passing through in hard winter, desperate enough to steal food rather than starve, was common enough in this territory that it might come to nothing more than that. It did not come to nothing. 3 nights after Falk's visit, Scout woke both sisters near midnight with a low, continuous growl that did not stop. And Josephine, lamp in hand, found a man standing just inside the outer dugout, gaunt and hollow-eyed, clearly starving, clutching a second strip of stolen meat in one shaking hand. He did not run.
He simply stood there, swaying slightly. And when Adeline arrived a moment later with the fire poker raised, he lifted both empty hands slowly, palms out, in the universal gesture of a man too exhausted and too hungry to fight for anything further. "Please," he said, his voice cracked and thin. "I mean no harm. I have not eaten proper in 6 days. I did not know this claim was occupied until I saw the smoke, rising from ground that should have been empty rock." Josephine studied him carefully in the lamplight, weighing the genuine desperation in his face against the very real danger two women alone had every right to fear from a stranger caught trespassing in the dead of night. "Who are you?" she asked. "And what were you doing on this land before we ever moved into that chamber?"
The man's eyes went involuntarily toward the bluff behind them, toward the cave entrance barely visible in the dark. "My father built that place," he said, quiet. "I have been trying to find my way back to it for 20 years. The sisters brought him inside, cautious but unwilling to leave a starving man outside in temperatures cold enough to kill him by morning, and fed him a proper meal by the hearth their father, if his story held true, had built with his own hands decades earlier. His name, he told them once the worst of his hunger had eased enough for conversation, was Marcus Reyes, and he had been a boy of perhaps 10 years old when his father had left their family in Missouri to seek his fortune out west, a departure that had shattered whatever remained of a household already strained thin by hardship. "He wrote to us twice," Marcus said, staring into the fire rather than at either sister. "Then the letters stopped coming. My mother always believed he'd simply abandoned us for good, found some easier life out here and never looked back. I never fully believed that. I don't know why. Something in me always thought there was more to it than a man simply choosing to disappear." He described searching for years, following what scraps of information he could gather, a territory named in one of the old letters, a rough description of a bluff and a limestone outcrop that had stayed lodged in his memory since childhood, and how he had finally arrived in this stretch of Wyoming only weeks earlier, nearly out of money and resources, to find the claim occupied by two women he assumed had simply settled empty land, with no knowledge of what lay hidden in the rock behind their dugout. His voice grew steadier as he spoke, the words coming easier now that hunger no longer clawed at every sentence, and both sisters found themselves listening with an attentiveness that surprised them, given how recently this same man had been nothing more than a set of unexplained footprints vanishing into the dark. "I saw the smoke and thought someone had found him," Marcus said. "Thought maybe he was still alive, still out here after all these years. I did not know how to approach two strangers and ask if I might search their land for traces of my father. So I have been circling instead, watching, taking what I needed to survive while I worked up the courage to simply knock." Josephine retrieved the leather-bound journal from where it sat on the shelf near their bedding and set it gently on the table in front of him, and watched something break open in Marcus Reyes's face as he recognized, immediately and without doubt, his father's handwriting on the first page. Adeline set a second lamp near him without being asked, and Josephine quietly banked the fire higher against the deepening cold outside. Small gestures neither sister discussed aloud, but both understood as the beginning of something neither of them had expected to extend toward a stranger who had, only hours earlier, been a source of real fear rather than growing trust. He read through the night, Adeline and Josephine sitting quietly nearby, giving him the privacy of grief, even in a room too small to grant true solitude. And when he finally closed the book near dawn, his eyes were red-rimmed but steady. "He built all this," Marcus said, looking around the chamber with an expression that mixed grief and something that looked unmistakably like pride. "He built this with his own hands, and he thought of us right up until the end. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't running from us. He was building something he hoped we'd find someday." "We don't know what happened to him after the last entry," Josephine said gently. "There's nothing after that final page." "I know," Marcus said, "but I think I finally understand why the letters stopped, and it wasn't because he stopped loving us. That matters more than I thought it would, hearing it plain after all these years of not knowing." He stayed through the rest of that winter, working alongside the sisters, widening the chamber further, repairing what time had worn down, and by the time the first genuine thaw arrived in April, the space his father had begun 22 years earlier had become something larger still, a shared home, built now by 3 sets of hands instead of 1, each of them carrying grief that had, slowly and without any of them quite planning it, become something closer to family. Spring brought its own labor, planting and repairing what winter had worn thin, and through it all Marcus proved himself steady in a way that eased whatever lingering caution the sisters had carried since the night they found him starving in their storage dugout. He did not overstay his welcome by presumption, always asking before taking on a task rather than assuming his place. And slowly, over weeks that neither sister could point to a single turning moment within, he stopped feeling like a guest and started feeling like family, the third leg of a household that had, until that winter, always been only 2. By the following autumn, the chamber that had once belonged to a lone, unnamed man calling himself only R had become something that would have been unrecognizable to him were he somehow able to see it, though the sisters liked to believe he would have approved of every change. The hearth had been rebuilt with a wider draw, cutting the smoke that had once clouded the room during heavy wind. A second chimney draw had been cut near the back of the chamber that year as well, giving the room a cross-current of air that kept the space from ever growing stale even through the longest stretches of closed winter weather, a small but meaningful improvement none of the 3 had known to want until Marcus, familiar from his own travels with how poorly ventilated shelters could turn dangerous, suggested it. The old shelves, cut originally for a single man's modest needs, had been widened and deepened to hold 3 households' worth of stores rather than 1. Root vegetables and salted meat and preserved fruit lined in neat rows that would carry them comfortably through whatever winter came next. Adeline, for her part, had begun keeping her own additions to the journal their father had left behind, filling the blank pages he had never reached with entries of her own, small daily accounts of the goats, the garden, the weather, and the slow, steady work of turning one man's solitary shelter into a home built for 3. She did not know if anyone would ever read her entries the way she and Josephine had read his, but she found comfort in the continuing of it regardless. A record left behind not out of necessity, but out of a wish to be remembered kindly by whoever came after. Marcus had taken to working alongside the sisters on the surface claim as well, splitting his time between finishing the chamber's improvements and helping manage the small herd of goats and the modest garden that had, under 3 sets of hands instead of 2, finally begun producing more than the claim strictly needed to survive. Dorian Voss, true to his earlier promise, had spread word of the discovery through Larkspur, with himself cast as helpful benefactor throughout every telling, and the sisters, along with Marcus, had grown accustomed to occasional visitors riding out simply to see the chamber for themselves, a curiosity the sisters tolerated with more patience than either of them might have predicted a year earlier, since it seemed a fitting kind of remembrance for a man who had spent 2 years of solitary labor building something meant, in his own words, to outlast him. Falk himself remarked, before he left that autumn afternoon, that he had seen a great many claims come and go in his years as marshal, most of them worn down eventually by hardship or loneliness or both, and that it was a rare and welcome thing to see one instead grown stronger with every hard season it survived. The winter that had once threatened to be their hardest yet had instead become, in the retelling the sisters found themselves offering to curious visitors throughout that following year, the season that gave them everything. Shelter proven sound, a claim secured beyond dispute, and a brother neither of them had ever expected to gain, arriving out of the cold on the strength of a father's old, patient handiwork. Marshal Falk rode out once more that autumn, not on any official business, simply to see the finished chamber for himself after hearing so much about it second-hand, and stood for a long while near the hearth, running one hand slowly over the smoothed stone of the table before speaking. "Your father built well," he said to Marcus. "This will stand another 100 years easy, the way he shaped it." "I hope so," Marcus said. "I'd like to think of it still standing, long after all of us are gone from it too." Josephine, watching from near the shelves she and Adeline had first cut with nothing but a chisel and cold determination, felt something settle in her chest that had not been there since before their parents died, a sense that the ground beneath her, quite literally, held more permanence and more history than she had ever imagined possible for 2 orphaned sisters scraping by on a hard claim at the edge of a hard territory. "I have visited this place myself, years after the winter that brought Marcus Reyes to their door, and I can tell you that the chamber the Caro sisters found still stands exactly as they left it, the hearth still drawing smoke clean through its shaft, the shelves still holding neat rows of stores against whatever winter comes. Standing inside it, hand against the same smoothed stone that Marcus once ran his fingers over, reading his father's final words, it is difficult not to feel the particular weight of what patience and grief and unexpected discovery can build together when given enough time and enough hands willing to keep building. Scout, grown a little grayer around the muzzle by the time I made that visit, still slept nearest the entrance most nights, the sisters told me, keeping the same steady watch he had kept the winter everything changed, as though some part of him understood, in the way dogs often understand what people take longer to name, that the space behind him was worth guarding. That is the story of the shelves that broke through into something no one expected to find, and the family that grew, slowly and without any plan at all, out of a stranger's decades-old kindness toward people he would never live to meet. It is a rare thing finding proof that a stranger's quiet labor, undertaken alone and unwitnessed decades before, can still reach forward through time to shelter people he never met and never could have imagined. The Caro sisters did not set out to find a home built by someone else's grief. They only wanted deeper shelves for their potatoes. What they found instead was a room that had been waiting, patient as stone, for exactly the right hands to finish what one man had started and could not complete alone. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video and share your thoughts down in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this one, stories of the old frontier and the people who built quiet, lasting things out of hardship, go ahead and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Thank you for spending this time with me, and until next time, take care of yourselves.